Coming up on 60 Minutes. The adventure of a lifetime that ended in tragedy.
People have died and someone's responsible.
The heartbroken parents of Bianca Jones and Holly Bowles.
We want justice.
Now demanding answers about why their daughters were given drinks laced with deadly methanol.
We can't have another family go through what we've all gone through.
Welcome to the 60 Minutes podcast, Extra Minutes. It's our first show. We're back. We're talking about a very important and a very sad subject. You can watch the full story, of course, on YouTube and 9 Now. The topic is methanol poisoning. Hi, Serge.
G'day, Tara.
How are you? Welcome back.
I'm good, thank you.
What a great way to start the year. I mean, it's a hugely important story. I think one that people possibly do not know much about, but also a really sad story for us to launch on.
It really was. It was heartbreaking, but like you said, incredibly powerful, and just having the privilege of being able to be led into the lives of these families to help raise awareness about methanol poisoning, what happened to their daughters, and the strength that they've shown to get that message out has been, really amazing for me as a producer. Yeah,
me too. As a reporter, we are privileged to have gone into their homes. What's so striking about this story is that strength of character has been reflected around the world, as has the grief and loss. So we speak to two families in Australia, but also two families in Denmark who lost their daughters, and we speak to a family in the UK where another daughter was lost, and thankfully a good friend survived. But it's such a tragic story. To hear it once is compelling, but then to hear it repeated and to know that distress is echoed around the world is really frightening and confronting.
It really was, and just how strikingly similar some of their stories are, and how similar the girls are, and what they were wanting to do in these places was just innocent fun. And to have that ripped away, and then hear about some of the stories from the parents that are horrific, what they went through in trying to find out what happened to their kids. And this global story that for us originally in Australia was just an Australian story because of these two Australian girls, and to really get into how far and wide it reaches is really, it's been quite something.
In pursuing how far and wide it ranges, you also discover how little is known about methanol poisoning. And when we spoke to Bethany Clark, who was the young woman out of England who actually survived, thankfully, you get this notion of, yes, we know about bad alcohol, it just gives you a bad hangover. That's sort of the extent of that sort of knowledge from her. But it's a danger that people do not know about. It's invisible, it's tasteless, it mimics alcohol, and yet the tiniest amount can just destroy your life.
Totally, and it's one of those things where I think when I first sort of in my life heard about methanol poisoning, it was actually like from an era ago when you hear about the bootlegging days in America and these old stories
like
of
Prohibition,
and you hear these old school stories about people going blind because they're making moonshine. And it's like, you think about it in that context in the past, if you even have heard about those stories. And it's only ever so often that you hear about these stories in other places in the world where it happens quite commonly because there's a lack of regulation around the production of alcohol, or people are just doing it in their backyards. And it's very easy for it to occur either by accident or because people economically, it actually can be cheaper to use methanol to make alcohol and extend it, I guess. So it's one of those things where I think for a while, maybe people had forgotten about it almost in Australia in particular, because it's been quite some time since something like this tragedy has happened to another Australian.
And I think that is part of it. That's the key, that it's probably far more widespread than we know, that, there are probably people who live in those communities especially where alcohol is banned, and people are making it themselves, people drink it and die, and we just don't hear about it because they're not foreigners, they're not, people we might relate to in terms of living in Australia or being young or whatever makes people newsworthy. So it happens all the time.
Exactly. And one of the things that makes it so difficult to pick up is the fact that in the initial phases, the symptoms, like they do mirror the same inebriation of alcohol. and then they mirror the same sort of nauseous, sort of fatigued feelings of a hangover. And so people just, if they have no idea that maybe they've drunk methanol, would just put it down to potentially being booze. And then on top of that, even in certain hospitals where there's maybe not the same level of medical care, it mirrors other kinds of illnesses as well, and so it can very easily be misdiagnosed. And as we found out in this story, time is of the essence when it comes to actually treating people, and that can be the difference between life and death.
Yeah. I was reading that accounts where people say they feel like they've had food poisoning, so they're not even motivated to really get help.
No.
You know, that really critical care in that critical early period. And you're right, for the people observing them, they just look like they're drunk.
Exactly,
And they think they're drunk because what they've drunk is alcohol to them. It's very deceptive.
I think as well, like for me, thinking about this story as well, like, you know, I'm still relatively young, and I think about it, and I think everyone that has been 19, like the two beautiful girls from Melbourne, they've all wanted to do these journeys. They've all thought about going to these places, and they would have all been doing the same sorts of things, and you would have thought about doing the same thing yourself. So there's nothing out of the ordinary to what they've done. It's just been a terrible bad luck that they've ended up in this scenario, and there's very little you can do to avoid it unless you just avoid alcohol, which is sort of contradictory to being a young person travelling in these sorts of places. So,
well, I think it's the type of alcohol that you need to avoid. And I think it's really important to make it very clear that none of the families that we came across describe their kids as careless, and I'm sure they wouldn't anyway. But
the opposite almost.
Yeah, the opposite, that they were quite conservative, that they were careful. And when I spoke to Bethany Clark, she'd cited the bottle that the alcohol was poured from. You know, there was no chance for somebody outside of that to spike her drinks. So she's watched the vodka being poured into the shot glass. She's collected it from the bar and mixed it with a drink. So to her, yes, it's local alcohol, but she thinks it's safe. You know, it's just not knowing where that local alcohol has come from. So, I mean, the tip has been, hasn't it, to drink beer or wine in those places if there's any suggestion of a question mark over what you're drinking. But there's just no guarantees. And you know, this has happened across so many places that we go to almost, you know, second nature, like Bali and Indonesia and, you know, now Vietnam, Turkey. Yeah, it's really frightening.
Doctors Without Borders, they have been looking into this a lot, and they say it's, you know, yes, it can happen as a byproduct of the distillation process if there isn't regulation, but there can be bad actors. There can be people who do illegally add it to booze, and so
that's to save money.
And like, you can tell people to just go for brands that they know, you know, not local brands and that kind of thing, but there's still a chance. You never know whether it may have been added to some of those things, and so it's an incredible risk that you just never know whether you're going to get the methanol or not.
I know, and also it's the tiniest amount, you know. 30 mils is a fatal dose. That's one shot. So for all those people who are drinking at the backpackers hostel in Laos that we've spoken to, you don't know, you know, they talk about having 5 or 6 shots. It could have been the first, could have been the last.
Exactly.
One dies, one doesn't. It's such a lottery. It really is. It is. Of course, the families are in deep grief, deep sorrow, but they're also angry, aren't they? Very,
yeah. No, they've just been dragged through the ringer in the circumstance. No information from the Lao government. Haven't even been contacted personally by them to say sorry. They were contacted secondhand, and they've just been given no information whatsoever as to what's happening with the investigation, what happened to their daughters, who is responsible for this methanol poisoning, which is just horrific. It's kind of compounded their grief on top of what was already the most traumatic experience.
They have great hope. They don't have much confidence.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, that's what they're sticking to now, is they just want to try and let as many people know, as many parents and kids that are potentially going travelling, to just be aware of this danger.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, putting this story together, it just is so, it strikes you how commonplace it could be. It strikes you how that could be your family or yourself, and I think that will really touch a nerve with anyone who gets to see the program and gets to listen to these families who've really stretched themselves to talk about this at such an early time in their loss.
Absolutely. And I mean, in all the time that I've been working as a journalist and putting stories together with, terrible scenarios, putting this story together, going through every screening and edit of the story, I found it very hard to not have a tear in my eye throughout the whole process almost. It really is heartbreaking, but also incredibly powerful when you watch these parents and see the strength that they have in telling the story to raise awareness. It really hits you.
Absolutely. They're so driven by hopefully helping no other family go through this.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the other thing that's really struck me about them as parents, particularly the Australian parents, is that they are just the most lovely people you could ever imagine. They really are. I've not had people that I've worked with on stories like this that have just been quite so delightful despite the circumstances. And so that really comes across in the story as well. And I think that the world, Australia, will get behind them in this and hopefully support them in their campaigns to try and get answers for both their daughters' deaths, but also just to raise awareness.
Absolutely. And, it's a very nice tribute that you pay them. And I think we should also mention the fact that they were so joyful for their girls going off and experiencing the world. I find that really appealing about these families, that they weren't scared, they were encouraging. They loved it. They're so proud, and they were just so happy that these kids who are on the cusp of everything at 19 got to enjoy themselves. They yearned for adventure, and they got adventure.
Exactly.
And that's a nice experience to have. So it's good to remember these families, of course, in their sorrow, but also in their joy and their support.
Totally. They love their daughters, and they were so happy to see them doing this adventure. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. It is really worth watching. So if you want to catch the full story, go to YouTube or 9Now. Thanks, Serge.
Thanks, Tara.